And the only other card I have is from the department who wishes to speak by Zoom, Craig Burnett and Jared Duquette. Craig, are you there?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, can you hear and see me?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for providing the opportunity to testify again remote. I'm sure I'll be seeing you at some time in the coming weeks, but again, I do appreciate your consideration at this time. With me is Jared Duquette. Jared is our new Chief of Wildlife Division. So he's with me to help provide a little bit more of an explanation of our reasoning. But I'd just like to start off, the administration is opposed, as he stated. I'd echo Amy Trotter's comments that we do appreciate the movement on the bill that we've seen so far from Rep. Borton regarding the NRC authority and the distance. But we also are concerned with the need to have language where it would exclude deer and elk from the feed. It really comes down to, it's a consistent concern we have on disease spread, which we've had several discussions over the years on regarding disease spread and feed placement of bait. So just, it's a consistency issue. We're hoping Rep. Borton will continue to have conversations and maybe consider including that language. But that's our reasoning behind it. So Jared, I don't know if you want to provide some of the more technical information on our beliefs.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for giving us time to speak this morning. So there's several things that we need to consider, especially from the body of scientific evidence that exists. Obviously, there's been a lot of study around feeding and baiting. So I'm just going to walk through a few things for you all to consider here. One of the first things that we need to look at is there's very robust body of evidence that suggests and shows in some cases that human-created baiting and feeding can lead to unnaturally high concentrations of animals. Take, for example, with white-tailed deer or with elk, and some of these examples that probably first come to mind is you have congregations of animals that potentially have disease, such as bovine tuberculosis or chronic wasting disease. And so creating those piles of feed and bait can concentrate those animals, exacerbating not only the risk of direct contact, say through nose-to-nose contact, but also indirect risk. So if, say, a deer comes in, spreads that disease to the bait itself or to vegetation or the soil, other animals come in and they leave at some point, especially after that bait dries up. And then that exacerbates the problem across the landscape here. So obviously a major concern for us as far as disease management here in Michigan. Another thing to consider related to that is that artificial bait and feeding can concentrate unrelated social groups of animals as well. So naturally you would have, take for example with deer, you have these family groups that kind of have these separate home ranges. Those animals find that bait, come together, eat that bait, and then go back out into their separate home ranges, et cetera. And so naturally that wouldn't occur if it weren't for that bait there. So we have to consider that as well. And also one of the things that we often kind of gloss over that's important to consider is that you get congregations of species that normally would not overlap. You kind of think of bird feeders and all the different species that come in to feed on birdseed, but then you extend that to, say, deer and elk coming into contact with each other that normally wouldn't occur in nature, particularly in that direct contact scenario there. So that's something that we also need to be consideration or have consideration of. And one of the other things that is a big issue here that we often kind of gloss over is the amount of bait, especially when aggregated across the landscape. We have potentially thousands of people baiting across the landscape with various types of baits and things, and this increases the nutritional capacity of animals beyond what they would normally get in nature. And so with all these potentially thousands of bait piles across the landscape, that raises the biological carrying capacity of populations. So how many animals that the natural habitat in Michigan can support. And when you get too many animals, these densities get too high, you increase the transmission rate particularly of diseases we know that are density dependent. So the more animals in an area, the greater risk of transmission, such as bovine tuberculosis here. And so this is a major concern, as well as that nutritional capacity beyond what you'd see in nature. The last point I want to bring up here that you all maybe are aware of or likely aware of already is the recent diagnosis of bovine tuberculosis in the cattle herd in Sheboygan County. And so right now we're commencing discussion of our memorandum of understanding with MDARD and how USDA is going to view that MOU. And so any policy initiatives that potentially undermine the existing baiting and feeding ban in the lower peninsula, we're concerned that it could give the impression to the USDA that Michigan is not serious about bovine tuberculosis control. So we have to be very careful about that as well. And as we go forward with this MOU and what that's going to look like and how USDA is going to perceive that. And so if the USDA were to perceive that negatively and potentially downgrade Michigan's current TB accredited free status for cattle, there is a great likelihood that it could cost the state and the cattle industry as well tens of millions of dollars. So this cascades not only to impacts to wildlife, but also to people here. Thank you for the time to comment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Burnett and Mr. Duquette. Mr. Duquette, we haven't had the opportunity to meet yet. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and what your qualifications are?
Yes, absolutely. So actually a Michigan native, my background is mainly as a researcher. And so I've worked on research with bovine tuberculosis in the northern lower peninsula. I've worked with chronic wasting disease in several states, such as Colorado, and most recently with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources and their longstanding CWD program there. And I've also worked as the Hunter R3 coordinator, so recruitment, retention, reactivation, but also worked on various studies across the country, including some in the Upper Peninsula, such as the Michigan Predator Prey Project, working with various species there, working with various avian species, cormorants, blackbirds, and various passerine species. And I'm also trained as a wildlife ecologist. I hold a PhD in wildlife ecology and management.
Where from?
Originally, my original residency?
No, your PhD.
Oh, PhD, Mississippi State University.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, in those states that you've worked in, Colorado, Illinois, do they have bans on recreational bird feeding?
I don't believe bird feeding, no.
Do they have do they have a history?
I could not speak to the specifics of if there is a specific ban and what those details would be.
Are you aware of any state in the country that bans bird feeding, backyard bird feeding?
I could not speak to that now.
Are you aware of any history or science or study that shows backyard bird feeding contributes to the spread of CWD or bovine tuberculosis?
No.
Are you aware of any studies that show that backyard bird feeding leads to unnatural congregating of deer or intermingling of social groups or of species that don't naturally? Are there any studies to demonstrate bird feeding is somehow detrimental to the ecology of any systems?
There is a decent body of evidence studies out there that show different effects on individual species in particular. So various songbirds. So
okay.
It does exist. Yeah.
Okay. So based on your testimony and the concerns that you listed about those kind of unnatural associations of different species and different groups, is the DNR today prepared to support a policy banning backyard bird feeding?
I would leave that to Craig.
Well, you're the chief. You're the chief wildlife biologist, aren't you?
Yes.
Are you going to make a recommendation to the director to recommend to either the commission or to the legislature that Michigan ban backyard bird feeding?
With regard to the effects on deer and other ungulates such as elk, I would recommend that there is prevention in the bill for potential risk of spread to those species. So any cervid species. Beyond that, I could not make a recommendation.
Well, I guess I have two questions. The first would be, why don't you care about the birds? And two, are you aware of any sort of backyard bird feeding system that could be implemented that somehow would exclude the possibility of interaction with the cervids?
Yes, I mean, that's the evidence is there for protecting birds as well. But our concern right now is with existing diseases. The research that has occurred, to my knowledge, is related to concentrations of cervid species, mainly deer and elk in Michigan. I am not aware of any studies that have been specifically done with any other species in Michigan the studies have been conducted in Michigan on potential spread in other species. So what I can speak to from a scientific standpoint and provide a recommendation on is that the bill would include preventative measures for reducing risk to deer and elk.
What kind
beyond
of
that,
what kind of preventative measures does the DNR believe would constitute properly protecting cervids or other species from backyard bird feeding's dangers?
So that would be within our existing baiting, sticking with our existing baiting and feeding ban for ungulates and the details that surround that policy right now, staying consistent with that.
So what is inconsistent about Mr. Borton's situation with the current standards that is opening him up to the tickets he's receiving from the department?
I don't know the background of that as well beyond what Mr. Borton has presented this morning.
Can Mr. Burnett answer that question?
I would say, going back to, we're asking that any recreational feeding be done in a manner to try to exclude deer and elk. As Amy had mentioned, there are some practices where people have designed items. I think when originally we asked that table be moved higher, that platform be moved higher. Again, we're asking for people to try to do what they can to exclude deer and elk. We're not asking for a complete ban on recreational feeding. We're asking that if you're going to do the recreational feeding, you do so in a manner to try to exclude deer and elk.
I can appreciate that, but what about what Mr. Borton was doing constituted grounds for the treatment he received? And this is not a throwaway question. This is the crux of the matter, because old ladies aren't going to climb up some 8-foot tall ladder to put some bird seed on a table. Not to mention the point that my colleague Senator Outman already mentioned about how the birds or squirrels will knock the seeds off of the table and have them on the ground anyway. So once again, I put to the department, either give me an example from Mr. Borton's experience that demonstrates why his setup is bad, or give me some definitive examples of how citizens can be assured they won't receive that kind of treatment. Do they need to put up 20-foot brick walls? Do they need to build a moat with alligators in it? What would you like them to do?
I was not with the department when the tickets were issued to Representative Borton, so from what I've been told, again, and as he stated, originally we asked that be moved higher. That was a request we had. And our officers are out there, they're trying their best to work with people, educate on issues such as recommending moving it higher. We've had people where we've gone out, we've tried to explain that, just move it up. Maybe there's a way that you can present it But our officers are out there trying to enforce the law as best we can. Whether the court system believes that that is a violation, that is out of our hands. But our officers are out there trying to implement the law as best we can.
But if the law is not definitive, then it's totally discretionary. Then it becomes arbitrary and capricious. And I don't understand what you want in this law to make you comfortable. And I don't understand a biologist who comes to the table and basically presents a case for banning all bird feeding altogether as being scientifically the best way to go, but won't just come out and say, let's just ban bird feeding.
Well, again, we've been consistent over the years trying to say that we are concerned on additional food sources being placed. I understand that you have not always agreed with the department's position on that, but it's not like this is a new position that the department's had. We have concerns when feed or bait is placed in a manner that can bring animals together.
I understand, but the concern here is we are crafting legislation for the people of this state, and they deserve clarity on the subject. They deserve to know whether or not they can expect the DNR to show up and write a ticket for them for feeding the birds in their backyard or not. And they deserve consistency from their experts on whether or not feeding birds should be allowed or not in the first place. And so Mr. Borton has written this bill. You say it's not good enough, but yet I still don't hear any specifics except just let us still have discretion. And that's not acceptable. So I know my attitude and reputation on a lot of issues with the department, but I am trying to set that aside here and deal with you in all seriousness. What does the department want to see? Do you want to mandate 8-foot tall bird feeders? Do you want to mandate walls and fences, electric wire? What do the citizens need to know so they can be free from harassment? I mean, do they need to call law enforcement whenever they set up a bird feeder and ask, are you personally, Mr. CO, offended by this bird feeder? Can I get away with this one? I mean, is it going to be that discretionary by region? I know that sounds ridiculous, but the citizens deserve to know.
I don't think we want to be that prescriptive in saying you have to use this one method to recreational feed. What we're asking for is language to be included that says exclude free-ranging deer and elk. That is our best effort, Mr. Chair. That's where we're at. That's where the department and administration's been for several years on this topic.
Do other members have questions for the department? Senator Bumstead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Has it ever been determined, Craig, or if bovine tuberculosis, where it originally started in Michigan, and is there any proof that spread from bird feeders that has ever happened up in Northeast Michigan?
Jared, I don't know if you have information on that.
Yeah, there's not to my knowledge. They're not directly tied to bird feeders exclusively.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Any other members have a question for the department? Senator Altman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When you talked about artificially inflating the carrying capacity of the land for certain species of animals, and I can understand maybe in northern lower Michigan where you don't have access to a lot of farm ground. I mean, we have a cabin in Montmorency County that, if there's any fields, of course, if there is any fields, there is. Matter of fact, we do have an 80-acre field that we plant with hay or corn, and when you do, there is 200 deer out in that field because it's the only place to eat. But when you get to where I live in central Michigan, I mean, I don't know that if there's anything to define the carrying capacity, because we've so altered it with, I mean, there isn't anywhere a deer can't go where he isn't going to feed. They're not browsing out in the woods eating twigs and stuff. They're out in the corn, they're out in the hay, they're out in the beans. So I have a hard time believing that any baiting really increases artificially inflates the carrying capacity of the land where I live. I don't think there's a bait pile I could put out there that would entice them as much as going out in the cornfield. And so I just, maybe with certain species of birds that aren't going to go out in the cornfield and pick at corn cobs, but I don't know. It seems like a red herring argument, that particular argument. I don't know. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say with agriculture, though, that is out of the regulatory purview of DNR. So beyond that, it's our concern is the geographic clustering of feed and bait. So that is the main concern, is that direct, but also the potential to deposit bait or disease in a very localized geographic area.
Well, I can certainly understand that, but I just, when you use the argument about artificially inflating the carrying capacity of the land, it just doesn't seem like a very valid argument. At least where I live, again, maybe up northern lower, because if there is a field that's planted, the deer are congregating there. But otherwise they are, you can see the browse line out in the woods of those areas, certainly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Altman. Any other members? Mr. Duquette, I guess I have to follow up. Are you basically telling us that, it's your scientific opinion that crop growing is bad for the deer population, but you can't opine on it because that's the purview of the other department? Because that's what I just heard you say.
No. Well, I can't comment on, there's no research that I am aware of on that, so I cannot comment on.
Isn't it true that the department encourages people to do food plots, provides guidance and expertise?
I believe we've given some, there are some items on our website that would explain how to do a food plot, yes.
Okay, so isn't that completely contradictory to what Mr. Duquette just told us?
I think what we're trying to say, what Jared's trying to say is, we can't go in, it's not in our authority to go in and tell a farmer how they raise crops. But
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. At least you
I'm
guys
just
have
trying to
some limits.
No, I'm just trying to clarify. So what we're trying to say is, DNR and the NRC can't go in and do that. So what we're trying to do to control
Not yet, anyway.
what we feel is a spread of a risk of spreading the disease is use the authority that we have, and that's what we're doing with feed and bait.
Right, but to Senator Altman's point earlier, and to Mr. Duquette's point earlier about the unnatural provision of food supplies to wildlife, yet the department is at times promoting the planting of food plots. And so isn't that inconsistent with the positions that you're staking out on this issue? That somehow bird feeding is unnatural and therefore bad for the ecology, bad for the biological systems, and yet the department itself is promoting food plots. Doesn't that strike you as being inconsistent?
Well, what we've tried to do is explain that when baiting and feeding policy was changed on that, people asked about food plots. So we provided information on what they could do in food plot. And Jared, you might be able to speak better to this, but our concern is less with somebody planting a food plot than dropping 2 to 5 gallons of bait in one specific area because of how that food is spread. Now, when it comes down to the agricultural purposes, again, what we're saying is we cannot control the corn and other items are planted. So again, we look at what we can work with, where we can try to enforce policy, and that's what we've done. Jared, I don't know if you have
I want to be
anything
clear, though, Mr. Burnett, that Mr. Duquette, in his first statement, did not speak to just the concentration of things in one spot, but to the unnatural impacts of supplemental feeding, which, whether it's concentrated in one place or not, is clearly unnatural. Well, I just pointing that out. Mr. Duquette, can you tell us, are you opposed to baiting philosophically?
If there is evidence that shows in Michigan and the native species in Michigan that would have a detrimental effect to those species across at a population scale, much like anything else, if there's evidence for that, that we are tasked with being stewards of the resources, the native resources. And yes, my position, and I can't speak for the department, but I would say from a wildlife standpoint, that would be detrimental to the population and go against our mission to protect the resource.
I understand that. What I'm asking is whether you have a philosophical, a moral objection, personally, to baiting and feeding. Because some people do, and I can respect that. I'm just asking if that's your position.
I cannot speak to my moral position on that. I can speak to my scientific view on this based on the evidence that's been in the literature.
Mr. Burnett, how much money is the DNR spending on checking on backyard bird feeders every year?
I believe our officers go in only when there's a report or a complaint.
Can we get a quantification of that?
On the number of complaints we get?
Mm-hmm.
I will have to check with our law enforcement, but I can do that, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Any other questions? All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you. I guess I just want to close this out by saying that I'm continue to be astounded and offended by the department's ability to bring up TB and the USDA memorandum of understanding whenever it's convenient to their own agenda, but then basically ignore it the rest of the time. The lack of success from this department and the Department of Agriculture on the TB issue is appalling, and farmers continue to be devastated by it as we see another herd infected, and yet the departments are busy patting themselves on the back all the time for what a great job we're doing after almost 30 years of lack of progress. So I just want to let you know how offended I am that that should be even thrown into the equation today.